budget for 22-23 school year was presented to the board and the community for the board's consideration. The budget detailed funds, which will cover needs surrounding student wholeness, literacy, leadership, and equity, as well as district office structure. The budget also highlighted additional funding and one-time funding provided to city schools for outreach, recovery planning, and other initiatives. Before the budget can be finalized, it is essential that we hear public voice on the direction the budget is taking. Your feedback allows us to focus on continued investments and prioritize funds in areas that directly support students and staff. As we continue working with the community to gather feedback on the budget, it is important to formally give the public another opportunity to provide additional comments. Today, the public can share their thoughts on the budget with us directly. Using the feedback from tonight, as well as comments raised through previous community work groups and feedback sessions, the board will review the budget and propose changes as needed. My colleagues and I are looking forward to hearing from everyone tonight. Thank you. Chief Doherty, I'll hand this meeting over to you now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Chris Doherty. I'm the Chief Financial Officer, and I will be joined tonight by my colleagues Joan Dabrowski, Chief Academic Officer, John Davis, Chief of Schools, and Courtney Desabey, the Acting Budget Director and Special Assistant to the Finance Office. We are very pleased, as the board chair laid out, to be discussing our FY23 proposed budget. Our intent tonight is to go over some of the highlights, but specifically to leave even more time for questions. So in addition to this presentation, there is also the draft budget book itself, which is a companion to this presentation that is available.
Chief Doherty, is that feedback where is it coming from?
I don't think it's me, ma'am, only because I'm alone in a closed office.
The last two digits, okay, they muted. Go ahead, I'm so sorry.
No problem, ma'am, of course. So as I mentioned very briefly, my colleagues and I are here to talk about the FY23 proposed budget, and we're going to hit the highlights and present to the group, but we know that this is in particular meant for interaction, so we'll leave more time than usual perhaps for questions and for input. This presentation, as comprehensive as it intends to be, is not nearly as comprehensive as the companion budget book, which is available and has been available since the original draft presentation last month on the board website. So with that, I will jump right in, and Courtney, you're nicely doing the driving again. If you can move to the next slide. As we are wont to do now, we ground ourselves in any presentation with how a presentation touches one or more of the board's priorities. And as you might expect, given that this is a presentation on the entire FY23 budget, we are touching all of the 7 board priority areas and in many different ways. So it's kind of a complete alignment, if you will, no one of these any more than the other. So it's kind of running the table board priorities. And also, just to, again, ground us a little bit, any budget, especially a budget of a public organization of this size, is and must be a reflection of what our students need in the coming year and what our communities want for their students and their schools in the coming year. And so that kind of at its essence, despite all the pictures and the bullets and the tables and the numbers, I think is worth pointing out as we jump in. It is a large document. It represents a year's worth of work for a large system, but at its core, it is meant to be what our students need and what our communities want for their kids and want for their schools. And we did And we reached out very explicitly to the community and to our schools to get input, as the board knows and as the community who's been following along in this process knows. So we want to be responsive, and we present this budget as being responsive to our community. Now, this year's budget planning was a bit different. There was even more than the average amount going on at a big complex district like ours. We are, of course, and have been for 2 years plus now, battling a global pandemic. And was it just March 2020 when our collective world changed with the arrival of COVID-19. And since then, we have done a lot of things differently, which, as we all know, we've also gotten an unprecedented amount of money from federal sources, specifically aimed at dealing with the challenges of COVID, the health and safety challenges, and also dealing with the unique educational challenges that such an unprecedented situation has caused. So this slide is actually meant just to show some of the significant things that have been buffeting our schools in our planning for this. R3, of course, is the shorthand for our district plan, specifically to emerge from the COVID-19 by reconnecting with our students, restoring and reimagining what education can be. And R3 is fully in train now. It's kind of a bridge as we get out of the COVID period. We're certainly not out of it now, but we have ups and downs, and R3 is our way of addressing those challenges and doing just as the name suggests. Kerwin is the shorthand for the wonderful new state funding that has been a long time coming and that many on this call have helped bring to bear, also called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. FY23, the main focus of this presentation, is the first full year where Kerwin's effects are going to be felt, and that's a very good news aspect of our FY23 budget. We have our blueprint that has been guiding our activities for years now. We are constantly looking at these things through the lens of equity, and undergirding it all is the community input that we've both formally and informally been soliciting throughout this multi-month process as we develop the budget. We again will get more into the numbers, but the FY23 top line is a very good one. We are up about 17%, or over $200 million on a year-on-year basis from FY22. And as I mentioned earlier, we have been in a good position, an absolutely needed position, of having gotten one-time federal funds to help us deal with the ravages of COVID-19. And most of us will probably associate those federal funds with what we did at first when it was health and safety, health and safety, health and safety. But those funds are not just for health and safety, they're also for a range of other things. As we emerge from the more immediate challenges of COVID into restoring and giving the kids back what they need. One, a return to normalcy, and then the reimagining part is trying to reflect that our goal is not just to go back to the way things were before. Of course, we have to keep kids in schools safe, but we have to almost take advantage of the shock effect and reimagine how we deliver certain education to, across the board. So that's what we're striving to do. And again, when we said we know what our students need, it's from listening to them and listening to their teachers and listening to the community. First and foremost, they need a safe and healthy in-person learning environment. They need to be individualized learning and supports, early and extended learning opportunities. So not just early, but also summer school, after school, before school, as much opportunities as possible. We're hearing loud and clear that we need to prepare our kids for life after high school, whatever that life after high school might entail. Lots of different paths after high school. And also mental health support. Mental health support is not something just because of COVID, but certainly the COVID trauma has underscored the need for coherent and available mental health supports across the spectrum. And again, that's not us hypothesizing from an office on North Avenue. That's what the community has told us over and over. And also, just briefly, access to arts and access to activities like sports, like enrichment, that really make kids excited and want them to come to school and stay in school. And as the introduction to what will be discussed later, when we went out to the community, and some of you were active participants in this, maybe not all, we had 4 public explicit community forums. One that was focused on youth, but not exclusive to youth. One that was focused on multilingual families, but of course, come one, come all. One was focused on community partners as well as the general public. And then one was fully general. We tried like heck to take advantage of the virtual aspect of the delivery. It's one of the it's one of the things that I think we're going to keep from the COVID environment, which was we found that we got more responses and more input when we did virtual meetings than if we had a physical meeting only. It's a lot easier to answer a survey if it comes to your phone and you can send a quick thought, in addition to a longer thought that you might send not in a text. So it's both and, as we say. We got over 6,000 what we call quick pulse poll replies, and the themes were consistent across all those different community forums, and consistent, I think, with other ways that we get information. It was hammering home extended learning opportunities wherever possible. And one school's extended learning opportunity is going to be different from another school's, but just the idea of kind of growing the pie, if you will, and getting more opportunities to interact with kids and to do good stuff with them. The mental health support was also very clearly discussed as something families and communities wanted more for their kids and for their schools. Tutoring, and particularly what we're calling high dose tutoring, was very clearly something that folks wanted more of. Improved school climate and culture, and arts and enrichment and sports. So the reason that we push on these is this is what the community told us, and this is what we hope is being clearly reflected in our FY23 budget. Because again, we did this in the early stages of this process, January, February, and informing what's going into the 2-part document that is for consideration for the group now, which is one, the presentation of about 3 dozen slides or so, but also the bigger book, the budget book, that is a reflection of where we're putting our money, what we're planning on doing, and how we're planning to meet the needs of the community. Courtney, I think I can move to the next one. And this is just another way to show the themes that folks were underscoring to us in all those forums that I've mentioned, and in those formal and informal ways that they indicate what it is they care about, what it is they want to see more of. If you can go to the next one, there's another point to make as we dive into tonight, and as folks look at the budget book. I didn't mean to suggest a minute or two ago that we're out of the COVID environment. We're not. But we're emerging from it, and we're doing a lot more than just staying safe. We're absolutely staying safe. But if you look at the spending and on what we've spent that one-time federal money on, you will see that it's gone from a clear health and safety focus to health and safety morphing into educationally focused activities and mental health supports and the like, because it's not just a matter, frankly, of staying safe, it's of thriving in this very challenging environment and getting into a position someday post-COVID when our kids are in a good position to continue in a post-COVID environment. So when we got the COVID funding, which the ESSER/COVID funding, what did schools do largely with their funding? They hired a wide range of temporary employees. In our system, we have a very decentralized system. I think we're proud of that. A principal typically is very much the captain of her own ship. She knows what she wants to do with her budget, and appropriately they're given very wide latitude to do just that. So what did schools do with this COVID money? They hired a lot of temporary folks to do a wide range of activities at their schools directed by them. And one person's temporary employee might be doing a whole range of different things, from a school down the street's temporary employee or more. Many schools use the funds for more than one temporary employee. A lot of tutoring. There was a good amount of tutoring with these funds. We saw it in FY22, and in a slide or two, we'll show you that what's working and what's making a good impact for kids. We're continuing to do that, as one would hope that we would. So we're seeing good amounts of tutoring in both FY22, which is the year that we're in, and in FY23, which is the year that we're talking about in a projecting way in the budget. Also, hearing what folks were saying, a lot of that money was spent on improvements to school culture and climate, right? Again, not picked out of the ether. These are what folks said they thought was important, and that's what the schools were focusing on. And of course, arts, sports, and enrichment activities. That was at the school. That was at the school level. Now, the reason on the other side of the blue line, or at least it's blue on my screen, the district also had an ability to use some of these ESSER funds. And it's not surprising that they're complementary to what's happening at the schools, but not identical. At the district level, we're in a better position to do things like bathroom renovations in 24 or more schools, right? The buying power of the district office, the expertise in the operations department to use these funds, which is certainly an allowable use, to do some much needed, overdue in some cases, bathroom renovations to make the school a more appropriate, more pleasant, more human place to do all these wonderful activities. We've renovated health suites in 21 schools. Those are health suites that certainly played a role and are playing a role in COVID. It's good to have a nice new health suite, COVID or no COVID. And so 21 of those schools had renovated health suites. We have spent a significant and appropriately significant amount of money upgrading HVAC systems across the district. And again, I don't want to say pushed. When the funds came to us via COVID ESSER funding, it helped us see the power of outdoor spaces for instruction, inviting outdoor spaces for instruction or for lunch, etc. But that certainly isn't just a COVID only kind of situation. A school is greatly enhanced by having attractive outdoor spaces for instruction, for lunch, for informal activities. And those are some of the things, again, there's a much longer list, but those are some of the buckets of things that your schools and your district staff have been focusing on with these funds. These very good ESSER COVID funds are going to run out. And they're going to run out at the end of FY24. And we've always known that they were one time. We've always known that they were going to run out. And we've been planning accordingly. So that is to say, no one ever said that they might go on longer. No, we knew how long they were going to be, and we're planning accordingly. This is just a little bit more detail. Finance loves to show numbers. In FY22, as of the time we put this slide together, to give the readers and the listeners a sense of what some of the specific categories were, over 77 million in supplemental supports were provided directly to individual traditional schools. And it's of a piece with what we mentioned before, but this was sent directly to individual schools. They did their own facilities upgrades, the tutoring that you've seen, the arts, athletics, and enrichment, and you see some other things there. So all those were for FY22, and now the next slide ought to show FY23. And the reason that we're showing it like this is where stuff has worked and where stuff has shown to add make an advantage in schools and students' lives. We're continuing with that with the ESSER and COVID money. So this is still that extra, that's probably not the best word, supplemental funds provided by the feds under the auspices of COVID and the ESSER grants. So here in 23, similarly, the summer programming has been a big hit. So we're investing more there. The tutoring has been deemed effective and needed, so we're continuing that. We still, of course, are spending on the more, I don't want to say traditional, but the kinds of things that most people immediately thought of when we first got clobbered by COVID. You're thinking about testing, you're thinking about health and safety coordinators in every building who have been worth their weight in gold, contact tracing. We're not out of that game. We're still spending significantly there, but we're in a methodical way, we're transitioning and using up every dollar of the federal funds and we're morphing it into what we're going to do on a recurring basis when the federal funds go away and the Kerwin funds, which is the state program of increased funding, is here to stay. And very briefly, you see mental health supports is another way we're using the COVID money, and the technology. So we're trying to actively have an approach where we keep doing what works, we keep doing what schools are saying, yes, more of that. And as we spend down the one-time money and ramp up with the Kerwin money. So one aspect, and this isn't a Kerwin specific presentation, at the same time, because this is the first full year of Kerwin, FY23, it stands being mentioned a few times. One hallmark of the Kerwin legislation is it by statute pushes the money out to the school level. So a lot, and by a function of what the individual schools' population of types of students is. So schools are realizing a significant gain in funds to the tune of 17, 18, 19% on average. Not every school benefits the same way, but what we're doing at the district level is some of these things that have been very well received by schools and families, the extended learning, the culture and climate, the arts and enrichment. When it was federal funds, it was largely driven, and understandably so, by district personnel as far as the funding goes. Now that schools are getting a long-awaited bump in funding from Kerwin, you will see some shifting. It'll be evidenced in both the FY23 budget and then in follow-on budgets, where certain things that might have been previously funded at the district level will now be funded at the school level. And the schools, I think, one, are benefiting from increased budgets, and it's the schools that are indicating that the bullets you see here are what they want to see more of. So it's our way, frankly, the district's way of trying to have our cake and eat it too, which is to use every bit of the federal funding for the most high impact items, and then set the schools up for when the schools are getting significantly increased allocations directly to them. They will have gone through the RRR period and the emergence from the COVID period, and they'll be in a position to fund their schools in a really data-based and solid way. So I think Courtenay, one last thing on Kerwin, because we'll be hearing a lot more about it, and we'll be speaking more about it. It is a funding source, so it helps us implement the programs that we and the district are delivering for our kids. So it isn't a blank check. It certainly has guidelines and restrictions. At the same time, it isn't that a school will do mornings will be one thing and afternoons will be Kerwin, or Tuesday is normal things and Wednesday is Kerwin. It's a way, frankly, after too long of a period where the schools were simply not getting the funding that they needed to do the things they wanted to do, it is now being rectified, and it's going to be over the next several years. And in FY23, the increase is in the order of $200 million. And it stands to go up from there. And all the more reason why we're having this methodical transition from the federal funds to the Kerwin funds. But this is just year one of Kerwin. We're going to build on this as we go forward. So it's a very good news story. And yes, there are reporting requirements and other things, but that's to be expected, and we embrace those things. We just want to empower the schools as much as we can, because it is new, and what's most notable is the increased funding. But we'll want to make sure that as the schools get more and more funding, they're being more supported by the district, so we can live up to the budget that we're presenting to you tonight. And I think from here, I'm going to go to my colleague, Joan Dabrowski. Dr. Dabrowski?
Thanks so much, Jordy. So good evening. I'm Joan Dabrowski, Chief Academic Officer. I'm happy to be here tonight to talk more about some of the academic areas of our proposed budget for fiscal 23. So as Chief Jordy mentioned, one of our strategies is looking at what's been successful and building on those. So as we think about personalized learning, We're so excited that we made a commitment around student learning plans. Over 50,000 students. That number is quickly creeping up towards 60,000 students have a student learning plan. We look to build on that success. We know there are things that we need to do around those plans to make them more efficient for our educators, more meaningful for our families together as we build these partnerships to support our young people. But we know that this is something to invest in and continue to build on. Our college and career readiness, again, we continue to think about the important offerings that we have for our secondary students, our dual enrollment offerings, our AP offerings, certainly the work of algebra and our refresh of our CTE programs. So again, that work will continue. Student wholeness, again, we're so excited by the work our schools did to put in place our student wellness support teams and student wholeness teams so that our students could be cared for as whole people. As Chief Doherty mentioned, that is a top priority as we continue to work through the space of the pandemic. Early learning, again, we know that if we are able to bring our students into our schools sooner, that we reap the benefits of those opportunities. And so again, we think about family engagement in this area and how we make sure we are creating early learning spaces that are both developmentally appropriate, rich with play and academics together, and preparing our young students to thrive as they come into our elementary schools. We also think about the work that we are doing in our buildings, modernizing those buildings, the upgrade of HVAC systems. I mean, Dr. Washington and her team have just done tremendous work in that space. And then certainly the arts. We know that our students deserve to have an opportunity to express themselves through creativity, through fine arts, through dance and music, dance and movement and music. So we're thrilled that we are going to continue to invest in those areas. So again, let's start with tutoring. As Chief Doherty mentioned, the work we've done this year has been substantial, and we're excited that we're going to grow it even further. You can see where that graph gets larger because we're investing more funds. So as we look at that shift from over 16 million to over 27 million, there is a real commitment to learn from some of the best practices that we've experienced this year about, again, what this high dosage frequent tutoring looks like, creating more positions so that we can really find a way to personalize the learning needs that our students come to school with. Go to the next slide. Again, extended learning. We were thrilled. This year we had over 90 schools who had a program. We want all of our schools to have a program next year, so it's going to take more investment to do that. We know that when we have learning either before or after what we consider the traditional day, we see better outcomes, and we're really trying to dig into this literacy and math instruction. So we will continue again to increase investments around the staffing, making sure we have materials so that we can again extend that school day and reimagine how we use that time. On the next slide, we'll talk about arts and enrichment. Again, we're just in a space now where we are growing the work of both our fine arts and our instrumental music programs for students. We know that the intentionality of how we recruit staff for these fine arts positions is another key strategy that we're investing in. So how we think about our Teacher Learn Connect program, again, pairing a novice teacher with a veteran teacher, that mentoring work is a key part of the work that we want to do. So you'll see that as we look for next year, again, we're hoping to have over 60 more new positions in this area. Again, recognizing that our students deserve these opportunities and the purchasing of instruments and materials and such for them to engage in these fine arts experiences. Go to the next slide. And then again, as I mentioned, our college and career readiness. Now, as Chief Doherty talked about, this is not necessarily a presentation tonight about Kerwin, but in Kerwin, they call out specific areas around academic programming, and college and career is one of the areas that's called out in terms of how we need to think about pathways, courses, et cetera. So some funding will be there for that work as well. And we know that where we've put in place some important opportunities like dual enrollment and the Navigator Center, that the goal for next year isn't necessarily about creating more positions, but serving more students. These have been really trying times for our adolescents. We know that we want to focus on their well-being and their engagement and that sense of purpose making for what's going to come next in their pathway. So we think a lot about how we reach them through these types of opportunities. We certainly are going to continue to roll out our CTE strategic plan. Again, that's going to increase more pathways to more students. And then again, our high school AP programs, again, we're really excited to bring on board 10 more high schools to engage in that work, not just of the AP, but the pre-AP, sort of, again, getting those young people ready for those very, very high level electives. And at this point, I believe I'm going to toss to my colleague, Chief John Davis.
Thank you, Dr. Dabrowski. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about our mental health supports. First, I want to call out our schools as they have done a great job at creating student support wellness teams this year. That has been something new that has been a coordinated effort to ensure we're giving as much support for any struggling student with their mental health. But with that, when you take a look at the budget, you can see that we're going to continue some of the same things we've done in the previous years, but there is more money going into psychologists and social workers. At the same time, we're also going to increase the folks that work with our students that are experiencing homelessness. And those are really important efforts that we know we've got to knock out of the park for next year. So again, you can see some increased investments, and we're going to continue the items that have been successful this year. Let's keep going. Dr. Dabrowski talked a little bit about arts, enrichment, and athletics, so you can see the same graph to the right. Part of that increased investment, right, is going to be with more middle school teams and more clinics, clubs, and intramurals. We provided funding for schools so that they could spend it on equipment or stipends, to really do anything they can, especially in the intramural space, because even though we all love teams and we want to go root for a middle school or a high school team, there's also opportunities for intramurals where we can get a much broader array of our student population involved in sports. So we did some of that this year. We're going to continue it and try to push it even farther, and we're even going to work to have more middle school teams. Let's keep going. When it comes to school culture and climate, one of the things I want to again point out this year, where we've been more intentional in our advisories and morning meetings. I really think this goes back to when the pandemic first hit in the spring of 2020, and each year we've increased our resources around advisory. But with that, we have also been more intentional with some of our schools that have struggled a little bit in our school climate arena, and we're going to make sure that about 24 schools that have struggled a bit will receive additional support. They've already started receiving it in the spring, and we will continue that next year. When you see the graph on the right, it may look like that our investment is going down, and that actually isn't the case. That is from a central office perspective. In this past year, we had funds that were designated for central office that we then gave to schools at $10,000 a piece. In this upcoming year, that money was put right on schools' budgets. And so the money is still there. And in fact, as a total amount, it is even increased because schools have requested student wholeness related positions. And in fact, in this upcoming year, there are 8 more student wholeness related positions. So there'll be even more folks working directly in our schools around school culture and climate. And then lastly, in technology, we know that over the last couple of years, we have had to increase our responsiveness, increase our IT staff positions to better meet the needs of our students. we're getting to the point, or we really are at the point, where there's a school issued device for every single child. And we also know that there are certain investments that we have to do and upgrades we have to make, so that all of the data and all the infrastructure that we have is protected. So those are the three main areas that we're going to continue and even increase our investment in technology. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Courtenay, as he's going to take it from here.
You're on mute, Court.
Can everyone hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was talking to myself for a bit. So yeah, we're going to start here with funded enrollment. Main thing to look at of note is that we've kind of hit a point where our enrollment has been relatively consistent over the last few years. There was a slight change in the funding enrollment funding for this year, a lot of fundings in that sentence, where essentially instead of just taking the straight enrollment from September 30th like it would have been last year, we were allowed to use the average of 2018, 2019, and 21 counts, which is actually a little bit higher. So we got funded for a little more than we would have if we were just taking last September's 2021 count. So that had us funded at $72,824. So this is the count for K to 12, not pre-K, which is funded a little differently. On this slide, we're showing our total revenue for FY23. Our total revenue is broken down into three major pots. So we have the general funds that we generally refer to, which is the majority of our funding. We have restricted funds, which refers to our grants, Title, ESSER, et cetera. And we have our enterprise funds, which is our food service funds, so it's reimbursement based on the meals that we serve. So these are the anticipated amounts for those budget lines. For the general funds, which was the bigger pot, the 1.359 million, this is our anticipated split on how we receive that funding for our three major sources, state being the largest at 68%, 917 million, local from City of Baltimore, 30%, 408 million, and then the combined other revenue, which includes, reimbursements, investment earnings, and the amounts that we contribute from fund balance, make up the other 2% of the funding for general fund. Our general fund distribution. So we look at this every year to kind of get a gauge as to how our general fund is being split. We have the largest bucket, which everyone's aware about, which is the school control budget. So this is what goes into what we call the school buckets, and principals have control directly over that funding. The second largest is that category of school support budget essentially. So these are items that we budget in central office, but on behalf of schools. And the next slide, we're going to go into a little bit more detail as to what's contained within there. We have our non-distributable fringe items, fringe costs that aren't distributed as part of our average fringe calculations. Our debt service, so an MSA, this is funding for 21st Century primarily, and our other bonds and instruments. And we have, the remaining 5% for central office in terms of what's like truly administration, in central office. So all in all, between the 74% in principal control budgets and the 13% in the school support budget, essentially, we estimate about 87% of the funding, in the general fund goes to schools either directly or indirectly. This is the section I mentioned, the school budget essentially. So it's a breakdown of a number of different items. One of the biggest chunks is transportation, which is budgeted centrally, but again, it's on behalf of schools. Same for utilities, so gas, electric, water, et cetera. We have a number of contracts in the CAO office. So a lot of our nursing contracts, a lot of these are special ed related, nursing contracts, speech contracts, et cetera, that are all about $6 million a piece. We have some major contract expenditures in the chief operating officer's non-admin, which is a lot of our preventive maintenance, so support for our buildings in 21st Century, trash removal, all the building maintenance workers and contracts. We have our out-of-county non-pub school supports budgeted centrally, our school police, some of the information technology department costs, like the costs that we spend every year for internet and phone access, and our home and hospital costs, are part of this centrally budgeted school support. In addition to that, we have a number of FTEs, and this shows the breakdown that are in central office, but also in central office working on behalf of schools. And we look at those who spend at least 80% of their time in schools. So that's another additional 524 FTEs who technically are counted as central, and it's split between different offices, but at least 80% of their time is directly in support of schools or in schools, which kind of gives a show of how much of central office is really dedicated and how much of the resources in central office are really dedicated towards schools and school supports. Kerwin revenue. So our funding this year is a little different from how it's been in previous years, and we've spoken about that at length, and we've had separate presentations on Kerwin. But just regards to our revenue coming in for the general fund, a lot of the funding for Kerwin is broken down into these categories, the biggest one of which is the foundation amount that we get. Second to that is compensatory, and you see the breakdown by percentages of the other categories. And we separated, the state and local. Kerwin is a little different also this year in that the local contribution is broken down by components and program allocations as well. It used to be that the local contribution was just one sort of like lump sum. But, in going with what we had mentioned earlier, there are restrictions with how we receive the funding and how the funding can be spent. So while there's increased funding, there's really a lot more thought and planning has to go into how that funding gets allocated to schools and how schools are allowed to use that money. This is the total Kerwin funding program. So this is what replaces our typical state aid funding. And what we see here, this full 1.4 billion is a combination of funds that we receive both from state and local. So the previous two pie charts kind of like squishing them together. But it also takes everything that's in the general fund and also funds that we receive as special funds, our grant funds. For example, our concentration of poverty, which we still treat like a grant, and our TSI grant, which we treat as a grant. So it's not part of our regular general fund, but it's part of the whole bucket of funding that we're allocated based on Kerwin this year, so that $1.42 billion. So Kerwin, like I said, we've presented on this and discussed it before, but we did want to give some highlights, kind of step by step, try to simplify how the allocation process went for schools with regards to Kerwin. So Kerwin, because everything's allocated based on a per pupil model, we had to combine the total revenue that we receive, like I said, from the state and local in each of those independent categories. So like foundation, we take the state amount, the local amount. Compensatory, we take the state amount, local amount. And from that, we identify the target population. So what is the enrollment that amount goes to? So what is the total enrollment for foundation? What is the total enrollment for compensatory? And those are different depending on each category because they're tailored to that category. So we'll count, English learners and special ed, et cetera, for each of those categories. And we use that to determine a per pupil amount that schools will get. And then in the individual schools, we look at what their enrollment is in those categories, and we calculate how much they need to get in terms of dollars to get them to their minimum 75% within that category. So that's how we allocate sort of each school's starting point. And then from there, once we make the 75% threshold, we still have a number of things that aren't fully covered by just the Kerwin category. For example, special ed, where we receive a significantly lower amount in Kerwin dollars than what we actually spend in special ed. So we make up for that by the other categories or spending above the 75% in the other categories to make up the difference. So schools start with achieving their 75% threshold. And in a lot of cases, schools could use funding for more flexible purposes. For example, if a lot of their funding is in foundation amount, because it's foundation, it can be spent on any of the students in the school. Therefore, it can be used for both of their special education or their other programs. So that was how the process, a very overly simplified version of how the process went this year. I'm sure schools didn't think it was as simple as we put on these slides. But this is the first year of Kerwin, and we're also reviewing what that's going to look like kind of going forward, taking feedback from how we've done it this year. We're engaging some consultants as well to think through and plan for us going forward and to understand how Kerwin is going to change, but really how we can preserve the priorities that we developed of fair student funding over the last 14, 15 years when we've done it, to make sure that Kerwin is, directly meeting all the goals and all the requirements, but still reflecting our goals as city schools in terms of engagement and equity moving forward. So that's what we plan to do and build on This year being the first and probably most complicated year, but the starting point for future growth and development with regards to how we're going to allocate the funding moving forward. And I think with that, it concludes the presentation. This point, I believe we're going to be taking some questions from the board members if they have any.
I want to ask my board colleagues. I see Darrell Brooks. I see your hand, Commissioner Brooks.
Yes. Thank you all so much for the presentation. Could you all go back to the mental health slide for me, please? Okay, so what I'm curious of at this point, given that we've been seeing an increased sort of challenges and particularly challenging behaviors in our school sites, and particularly when we think about the ways in which sort of mental health sort of intersects with sort of the cultural context in which most of us are sort of living and operating, and the fact that students are actually experiencing right outside their schools traumatic experiences. So when I see this number, I am a little bit disappointed that it's only about a 2.5 million or 1.2 million increase in mental health support services. And so I'm curious, again, I don't think I actually got the answer to my last question at our last meeting. What was the proportional increase of mental health support dollars in this area? So I see the money, the dollar value, but what is the percentage increase from the prior year?
Commissioner Brooks, this is Chris Doherty. May I start with a response?
Totally.
Thank you, sir. Of course, you are correct. We are working on we are working on the FY21 numbers, and I did not think, frankly, they were ready for prime time for this presentation. But your request, we're almost completed with your request. You, of course, are correct in saying that the difference between FY22 and 23 is, less than 2 million over 45 million. So that percentage is easily arrived at. From my perspective in the finance office, what I see at play here, sir, is the significantly increased amounts spent on mental health supports in 22. And what I mean by that is, and again, we haven't completed our due diligence for your request, and we will have that done soon. But FY21, I think this graph, which we wanted to show you what we did have, although it may look on its face like a not very big increase, which it isn't, because it's, just to keep us in, it's in the neighborhood of what, 4-ish%, just doing it off the top of my head. It represents a big uptick from FY21. And so we like to think that with these numbers, we're continuing and slightly increasing the significantly buttressed mental health supports from historical levels. So that's a little further away from it than the people actually delivering the work. But I think that is important to say that historically, these two columns will show the increase, but together they look almost like twins, and that's why we're not quite ready to answer your full question with the data.
Great, thank you. And so definitely I can hold two things at the same time. I can hold the acknowledgement that this is a historic sort of increase in sort of the infrastructure mental health support services. And I can also hold that this particular moment feels so significant that my question really is about, is it enough? Right? Okay. In this particular moment, knowing that we have the behavioral sort of situations occurring on or near our schools, and our students are literally experiencing traumatic experience leaving their buildings, is this sufficient? And it wasn't sufficient before COVID hit, because I know that our ratio between our mental health providers and our student population was woefully insufficient. We were at some ridiculous number around mental health support services per student in terms of mental health access. And so what I'm curious about then, if addressing the culture and climate and the behavioral issues of our students are also associated with our mental health, I would love to hear, whether it's Allison, Chief Perkin-Cohen's or Dr. Sonia Santelises, to come on and talk to me a little bit about sort of what these mental health supports are going to actually look like. And do you think it's enough? Because I can tell you, I don't think it's enough of an increase to sort of address sort of the mass challenges that we're facing right now as a district.
Yeah, no, thank you, Commissioner Brooks. And I don't think that there would be any disagreement about where we are historically in the need, and to your point, where the need has been to increase the mental health supports long before COVID that have just been exacerbated. A couple of things that I will say we are watching very closely, and that is the ability to actually hire for a number of these positions. So when Chief Doherty referenced the very significant increase that showed within fiscal year 21 from where we were, I think one of the pieces we're also trying to hold is being able to fill those positions. So we had already moved in the direction, and I know you know this, but we had already moved in the direction to put a very different, for lack of a better term, floor with regards to things like social workers that had previously not existed. We also in fiscal year 21 made a big move to say, well, okay, there are some schools who need more for a variety of reasons, some that you mentioned and some based on size, but all based on need. I do think that one of the pieces that we are really challenged with as the nation is, and we're not the only school district either in the state or the country that is facing this, is real. And a matter of fact, I talked to Delegate Ampry about this and his work that he flagged for me almost 8 months ago to a year ago for this session, is really diversifying and stepping up the recruitment of mental health professionals, because he recognized that there's just a dearth of people in the positions to meet the needs. So part of what we will do in the analysis that we're bringing you is actually also compare kind of what is the, where are we in actually being able to fill positions, because creating the positions but not being able to fill them from a school level is a disincentive. I think from, to just add more when you're trying to get your first round of mental health supports filled. The other piece that I don't think is fully represented here is the amount of coordination that we have been trying to do, with more community-based mental health providers, with the city, and helping to direct and link. And some of that, to put it quite frankly, is getting some of our community-based mental health providers, providing them with assistance that I know Chief High-Cupboard, Chief Doherty, and Chief Sivin have been working to kind of help people, frankly, navigate the contract labyrinth that is public funding and that is tied to a lot of this funding. So what we're also hoping is that as we help our community partners navigate some of those contractual requirements, that we'll actually also see more partnering with the community-based health organizations, because frankly, we can't hire enough school psychiatrists and other therapists. I don't think that means we don't need to be mindful of it in the way that you're pointing out, and I think it's the right questioning. And then another piece I would just finally add is we're also looking at the need from a variety of standpoints and entry points. So the mental health supports are absolutely there, increasing those and recruiting. The other piece that we're also seeing, and this year has been frankly evidence of that, is the number of young people, certainly not all, but the number of young people for whom some of the climate work that we have been doing in schools actually is also incredibly supportive. So there are mental health needs of students that are absolutely clinical, absolutely need a kind of professional, semi-medical response. there are also needs that are met from young people actually being in healthy school communities and healthy school cultures. And we are really trying to look at all of the pressure points that really are, weighing and impacting young people that, that you're referencing. I don't think it's wholly sufficient, but I do know that there's a kind of disincentive built in to only rely on adding more positions when folks are having challenges meeting those. I think the opportunity, though, is to really move in some of these other areas to bring in other partners in ways that previously in city schools they weren't able to, because the volume, I like to call it a labyrinth, of what it takes to navigate, some of the requirements has been a disincentive for community organizations. So I would just say it's a combination of many things, but to your point, it's an ongoing need.
Thank you, Dr. Santalisa. I really appreciate that.
Were there any other questions from any of my other board colleagues? Oh, Commissioner Roberts, I see your hand.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. This is in my face. First and foremost, thank you so much for the presentation and for everyone that has worked so diligently pulling together this year's budget book. I think for me, one of my questions is directly associated with professional development opportunities. We received a wonderful presentation in the Operations Committee last month around Lead from Your Seat, teacher and principal pipeline. But something that I know the board has consistently been talking about is, with the influx of dollars coming into the system, what opportunities exist for the various levels of support for not only our school leaders, but for those that support our school leaders at the district level and I'm going to call it the interim, so like our ILEDs, who's supporting our chiefs, who's supporting the personnel that offers support to school-based staff. Where can we see that in the budget?
So I'm happy to jump in, Chief Doherty, if that's okay. I can say a few things just about some of the work we're investing in regarding professional learning and where we are using some of our ESSER dollars to really, along with some of the most recent opportunities from the state, the Maryland Leads Grant, to put forward a number of different opportunities for professional learning across multiple layers of colleagues, as you called out. So what is the classroom teacher? What about the special educator? What about the principal? What about the district coach and the ILEDs? So there are layers that we're thinking about. There's the leadership layer, there's the practitioner, direct working with students layer. And what we're carving out is what we can plan for in summer, some of the foundational, deeper times where we can do longer sessions. So we're excited that this summer we're offering summer institutes for our educators to come and have opportunities to go deeper on topics such as foundational literacy skills, how we use some of this wonderful technology that we've really become comfortable with over the last years, and go deeper with blended learning. So we've identified some core topics to help our educators become more, I think, comfortable and proficient with some of these important pieces. And where last summer it was a really tricky time to bring people back together, we're emphasizing these summer institutes to be in-person opportunities. So we're excited that, again, using both ESSER dollars and pending some funds we hope from the Maryland Leads Grant, we should have significant funding to be able to open up hundreds of seats for these summer institutes for our educators. Additionally, we will be having our June Leadership Institute for our school-based leaders. We have an Operations Institute. We have a Special Education Institute for leaders throughout the summer, as well as our August CEO Institute. So again, putting those foundations in the summer. And then the next space of this is then how do we then use our systemic days that we came forward in our calendar, use those systemic days to build off of summer learning. So I think we're working now that we're hopefully going to be an in-person space for this adult learning, how do we use the in-person along with virtual spaces to train up, to give people the supports they need? How do we use virtual in between times to allow educators to collaborate with each other? So we're excited by this, and we feel like it's been so challenging the last 2 years for our teachers that putting more on them around some of these professional development courses in the summer, the timing wasn't right last summer, but we're so excited that we're launching it. We'll be talking more about it at tomorrow's Teaching and Learning Board Committee, coming forward with some of those details. And we're excited about the work that can live in schools now. Some of this additional funding allows for principals to make sure that their teachers have common planning time where they can work in teams and engage in content cycles of learning where they dig into a topic and look at student work together and make plans for how they're going to try things in their classroom. Again, we're also looking at the different roles we have out in our schools that support our educators, whether it's a literacy coach or whether it's a multi-classroom teacher who's supporting a teacher. So we've got different structures. We're really excited about being able to organize those and get strategic on some of these key topics as well.
I appreciate that, and I'm not sure, Madam Chair, and perhaps Chief Davis can circle back with me because I know IEDs are under his purview, and there's a few other, like as I mentioned before, you know, just district staff. How are we investing into district staff as well to best support our school communities that in some cases are getting an influx of dollars that they've never seen before? And so how are we maximizing them at the school level, but offering support to best support those in with the increased funding?
So one of the things before Chief Davis can certainly speak on ILEDs. What I would also add, Commissioner Roberts, is that there's a portion, and I don't think Dr. Grant is on this evening. Excuse me, Dr. Durant. What I would say is we're also doing a lot of the development of central office through the work that we're doing with Wallace that's actually going to help us map out what that needs to look like in a more in-depth way. Like I don't want to sound like we've got that system built out because it's not yet. I think what we have is components. So I got a chance to speak to the Leeds Fellows last week, which really we're now on our third cohort. That is all built and developed. It was during Chief Grant Skinner's tenure. And we built that out specifically as a leadership opportunity for a small select group of central office leaders because we realized the gap that you are referencing, right? That it's not just about kind of frontline folks, but what about the people actually supporting them? And in that cohort, you saw numbers of the folks that you're referencing, right? And this was part of that development. I will say the other piece that Dr. Durant and I have talked about is what is the organizational capacity to develop leaders beyond just, frankly, who we traditionally think of as development targets, the teachers that Dr. Dabrowski referenced and principals. And so what the Wallace Grant is helping us do and what we're using it for, and I think under Dr. Durant's leadership is very strategic, is exactly that question of how to build a pipeline more deliberately using that Wallace equity, frankly, financing that we have. We probably have more focus on it now and being able to, and that's one of the goals of the Wallace money, so that it might not show to the extent yet in the actual, like, you know, the budget you're looking at now, but part of it was we wanted to make sure we built the infrastructure and realized that's something that we need to be able to do as a district. So I just wanted to give you that context that I think also specifically addresses some of the groups that you were referencing.
I really appreciate that, Dr. Sonsoles, and your remarks as well, Dr. Dabrowski. Chief Davis, did you have anything to add?
Thanks, Commissioner Roberts. I was going to add maybe two things. One is when we think of what Dr. Dabrowski said, what we're going to do this summer with different school leaders and also with teachers, What we're also intentional about is backing that up so that the central office leaders get something very similar ahead of time. So there's alignment in that space. I think the second thing is executive directors and directors, they have a different view on the organization than a lot of folks do. And so Dr. Dabrowski and I have been intentional about some of the work we do on Mondays with our combined teams, where they are leaders over larger offices. And in that professional development, try to give them something a little bit different.
I appreciate that, Chief Davis. Thank you so much. Madam Chair, that's it for me.
Thank you. Dr. Santelises, will we learn more about the Wallace program that you were just referencing?
Yeah, absolutely. Chair Richardson, I think this is a good point, you know, as we build out and work with the board to build out the calendar for this upcoming year. I think that's a great place to make sure that we situate this question, because we have heard the board, and I think that actually was part of the, I don't want to say the selling point, but it was definitely part of our intent with the Wallace grant. And I think that's something that, you know, Dr. Durant and I can work on alongside on that. So yes, we can do that.
Awesome, thank you. Are there any other questions from my colleagues? Don't see any hands raised. All right, without seeing anybody, and I'm looking at both of my screens, I don't see anyone. That is then our meeting for the night. We appreciate the staff and another wonderful presentation around the budget. And we are, you know, very, very grateful for you and your team, for the whole cabinet, but in particular, Chief Doherty, for your leadership in putting this all together. I actually do see a hand. Is that a hand?
It came and then it went, Madam Chair.
Oh,
It came
I
and
am
it
so
went.
sorry.
Are there any members of the public that I would give an opportunity to ask a question?
Oh, I am so sorry to come at the very end, but may I'll ask a really quick question if that's okay.
Zen. Okay, good. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So this is more like a general question. It's just like for the budget itself. So I know that we're trying to plan this to make sure that we have everything set for all of these upcoming years, and that they can technically change year by year. But as surprises and like events that are coming up, or we can't always foresee, can the budget even change within the year itself? Like even if just like the COVID itself, how we had to change things up and then focus on testing, if something else like it comes up, that we can keep modifying the budget itself.
Madam Chair, may I take that one?
For sure, yes.
It's a very good question, and it's this is Chris Doherty from the Finance Office, and it's a very good question. And I'd say any budget, let alone a budget for a very large, complex organization like ours, is certainly not going to be able to predict all the things that will happen in the 12-month period from July 1st to June 30th. And so the answer to the question is yes, there can be changes, and there normally are changes. They're not done cavalierly, that when something cannot be treated within the budget as approved, then staff go through the CEO and present a proposed budget amendment to the board, and it's as open and formal as the board, as the budget process and approval itself. And they can come in all shapes and sizes. Generally, they're not very, very small, because if they were really small, there would probably be a way to address it in the normal course of business. But it does absolutely happen, and it's not even a bad thing when a budget amendment comes to the board and they're asked to make XYZ consideration. It is not a signal that something went wrong, but even as the questioner indicated, something unforeseen came up and there was no appropriate a fund of money to use. And so we usually err on the side of more budget amendments rather than less for transparency's sake. And so, yes, they do happen. They take work, they take time, they take board attention. So we don't do them lightly, but at the same time, when they're necessary, and the board is used to getting them. And so, yes, I bet there will be some for FY23 as well, but we don't know what they will be. So I hope that's a full enough answer to the excellent question.
Oh, that is wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zen, and thank you, Chief Doherty. Again, I want to thank everybody for your time tonight. And I'm going to give us an early night. So have a good night, and I'll see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Good night.
Good
Please
night.
take care and stay safe.
Good night, everyone.